Imagine a problem so ancient that it's almost timeless, yet so current that it could be happening just around the corner. Today, we're exploring the awful world of human trafficking and tracing its roots back to the age-old practice of slavery in Asia. In this video, we'll look at how traditions of bonded labor in Asia, stretching back centuries, turned into the huge human trafficking networks we see today. We'll look at horrifying scars left behind and the new forms of slavery that still exist today. Watch until the end, and you'll understand the history and modern versions of human trafficking, which will help you recognize and fight this constant issue. You'll see how these practices have evolved and how they continue to ruin millions of lives around the globe today. Let's start with a trip back in time. Long before the huge skyscrapers and busy markets that have become part of modern Asia, there were empires stretching across the continent. These empires were built, quite literally, on the backs of slaves. From the Great Wall of China to the grand palaces of India, slaves were forced to create these famous structures. But who were these people? Usually, they were captured warriors, indebted peasants, and even criminals bound by iron chains, as well as social and economic circumstances. Imagine being born into a family indebted to a landlord. This debt, often impossible to pay off, could chain generations to servile labor. In ancient times, who you were born to could determine your fate as a slave. This generational curse meant that slavery was not a simple condition. It was a legacy, passed down forcibly from parent to child. These slaves had hugely varied work to do as well. In the lush fields of Southeast Asia, they toiled under the scorching sun, cultivating rice and spices that would fill their masters' coffers and feed the growing appetite for global trade. They would plant and harvest rice and spices, mostly to feed the local population, but they were also forced to support a global trade network. Under the sweltering heat, the only value of their labor came from the wealth they made for their masters. They were feeding an ever-growing appetite for exotic goods in distant lands, mostly through the Silk Road. Humans were a commodity that people traded and sold. Meanwhile, in the elaborate households of imperial China, slaves whispered as they carried out their duties. They were hidden away in secret places in the opulent palaces, never to be heard or seen as humans. These slaves were just part of the machinery that made these households. They were also part of large-scale public works projects. Most slaves had no social mobility, although there was some leeway in administrative roles. If you worked for a rich and politically powerful master, you could have more social mobility. Across Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, trade and enslavement were just a normal part of the local economy, although it never should have been. There were formal and informal regimes that made slavery part of society. This is one of the biggest reasons why slavery continued, even as economic and social conditions evolved over the years. Fast forward to today, and you can still see these ancient practices are still heard. Modern human trafficking has many of these old structures. The same desperation that drove ancient empires to enslave their captives now fuels a billion-dollar black market. In this market, people are the commodities, and traffickers are happy to trade them across borders. According to some sources, there are as many as 120,000 people who are being trafficked in Southeast Asia today, but the number could be much higher. Those ancient chains of bondage have become the digital threads of the dark net, where human traffickers lurk, waiting to lure unsuspecting victims. The internet is a modern marketplace, not just for clothes or technology, but tragically for human lives. Here, traffickers have anonymity and the freedom to hide their trade far from prying eyes. Some of these modern-day traffickers use the promise of employment to trap their victims. For example, a young person in a struggling rural area of Southeast Asia might see an advertisement promising a well-paying job in a big city or even overseas. Hoping for a better life, they follow the breadcrumbs of opportunity, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare of forced labor. Recruiters target the most vulnerable, usually those without access to education or with urgent economic needs. The job offers seem legitimate, complete with contracts and travel arrangements, but once they touch down, the traffickers snatch their passports and begin making threats. In similar cases, traffickers promise young men and women from poor backgrounds a job in the tech industry. They tell them they'll be working with cutting-edge technology and making good money. However, the reality is anything but. Once they arrive, The traffickers take their identification documents and lock the victims in rooms lined with computers. They become part of a huge scam operation. They're forced to scam others over the internet, with surveillance cameras watching their every move and their captors scripting every word. Reports show this happening to hundreds and thousands of victims across Southeast Asia. In Indonesia alone, around 3,400 people were trafficked for online scams between 2020 and 2023. Victims are in foreign lands, unable to speak the local language, isolated from help, and forced to work under brutal conditions. Some of them work in sweatshops, domestic servitude, or worse, the sex trade. They're isolated and forced to depend on their traffickers for food, shelter, and the smallest bit of kindness. Fear and threats become daily realities. Some are told that their families will be harmed if they don't perform or try to escape. It's psychological manipulation. Others are stuck by debt bondage, another echo of the past, and told they owe a debt for their travel, accommodation, and training. No matter how hard they work, that debt just never goes away. This is not just about small incidents. This is a huge network, a well-oiled machine that spans the globe. Those old slave trade routes are now powered by technology and driven by a ruthless disregard for human dignity. In this modern form of slavery, technology helps traffickers reach further and become more powerful than ever. Cyber technology means they can scale their operations on a huge scale and still remain anonymous. They can send encrypted messages and untraceable payments. The internet gives them a secret workflow that authorities can neither trace nor dismantle. When you think about it, it's a paradox. The same tools that allow us to create and connect are the same ones criminals are exploiting to continue age-old crimes. Traffickers today don't need to chain bodies to control them. They chain minds through psychological manipulation and technological surveillance. So, how do we break the cycle? For starters, you've got to remember that modern slavery is not just physical labor or change you can see. It's in the hidden corners of the internet, tucked away behind the appeal of modern technology. Sometimes you might spot signs of it in real life. Victims sometimes show signs of physical abuse, such as bruises or scars. They could be malnourished, poorly clothed, or lack any personal possessions. They might avoid eye contact and appear fearful or anxious, especially around certain individuals. Victims facing labor exploitation usually live in cramped and unsafe conditions. You might notice that they go to and from work in groups, almost like they're controlled or closely monitored. They may work excessively long hours under harsh conditions without appropriate safety gear. In service industries like nail salons, massage parlors, or domestic work, watch for workers who seem unable to speak for themselves or who have someone else speaking or negotiating on their behalf. Another key sign is that they don't have any control over personal documents. Traffickers usually confiscate passports, identification, and travel documents so their victims can't escape or seek help. These signs are difficult to interpret by themselves, but together they could suggest someone isn't free to speak or act on their own behalf. Awareness and action are our strongest weapons against this crime, and understanding the signs of human trafficking is the first step toward destroying these exploitation networks. Reporting these suspicious activities to local authorities can make a huge difference. You've got to make that call, send that message, and take action. Don't worry about being wrong or making a mistake. The worst thing that could happen is that it's all a misunderstanding, but the best? You could save someone or many people's lives. You can also support the numerous non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that work tirelessly on the ground. These organizations rescue and rehabilitate victims while also educating people to prevent trafficking in the first place. Even if you can't give money, volunteering or simply spreading the word about these organizations can seriously help. The idea of a future free from modern slavery is ambitious, but it's not impossible. It begins with awareness. Understanding the scale and seriousness of the problem is the first step. We've all got the power to teach ourselves and others about the realities of human trafficking, its signs, and its consequences. The more we know, the harder it becomes for traffickers to work in the shadows, but awareness alone isn't enough, and we've got to follow it with some action. We've got to push for stronger laws and punishment against traffickers, as well as support rehabilitation programs that help survivors rebuild their lives. These vulnerable populations deserve to be protected, and we need to give them chances to reduce the risk of them being exploited. If everyone who watched this video took one of these actions, the ripple effect could stop trafficking networks around the world. We could save countless lives and give people back their dignity after suffering for so long. The path to a world without slavery is long and it's filled with obstacles. But It's a path worth taking. Together, step by step, we can dismantle the chains of modern slavery. It starts with a choice, here and now, to not just be a bystander, but to be a trigger for change. What are you going to do?